Welcome to Muffin Talk.
Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. This program is brought to you by the initiative Titipounamu, Study and Joy. I'm pleased to welcome back today Professor Thomas O'Loughlin, who is joining us from the UK. Thomas O'Loughlin is originally from Dublin, Ireland. He is an ordained priest and emeritus professor of historical theology at the University of Nottingham in the UK. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much, Beata.
Tom, today I was thinking I'd like to ask you about the gospel. So at every Mass, the presider or deacon proclaims the gospel, the good news. What is the history of this part of Mass?
Well, let's begin by noting that we can talk about the gospel or a gospel. And usually today, what we mean is reading one of the four texts that are canonized by the Church as the Gospels, and they are part of the Scriptures, part of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But before you can talk about a gospel, you have to think about the word the gospel. For instance, St. Paul, writing a generation before any of our four Gospels were written, talks about his duty to proclaim the gospel. And he wants to bear witness to the gospel, and he is a witness to the gospel. Now, what is the gospel? First of all, the word the gospel has no background in Judaism. Its background is in Hellenistic Greek. And in the Greek of the first century, a gospel was a gift that the emperor sent to a city. He sent it in the form of a plaque, and the city put the plaque up in its main temple, and it was a statement that the emperor was taking the city into his personal care, and in response, the city was to see itself as especially loyal to the emperor, and they were going to serve the emperor and, of course, pay their taxes. A gospel is a relationship of a big power to a group, and it's one of protection and one of relationship. If a city had a gospel, it had a relationship. Now, imagine the first followers of Jesus speaking to a Greek world, and they have a rich language coming from Judaism. They can talk about a covenant with God. They can talk about a relationship with God. They can talk about having become the children of God, the people of God. But if you use a word like covenant in Greek, diatheke, it just means that they've been given a bequest. It's a legal word that has no bigger meaning. So they needed a single word to capture their sense that God had done something wonderful in Jesus and what Jesus meant to them. Not just Jesus' speeches, but his miracles, and above all, his death and their belief in his resurrection. So they're saying, well, is there a word for what the whole Jesus thing means? And some genius, and we don't know his name, it's older than Paul, because Paul takes it up as something that he inherits as an accepted usage within the churches, came up and said, God has given us a gospel in Jesus. So just as a city is taken into the protection, made into a relationship with the emperor through the emperor sending a gospel, so this community, the followers of Jesus, have been taken into a relationship with God, and this relationship is everything that Jesus means to them: his words, his deeds, his death, his resurrection.
So if Paul had not gone out to the communities and to non-Jewish communities, we might not have the word gospel at all.
If they hadn't gone to communities where Jewish words like covenant would have been laughed at as meaningless, because they're words that belong to people who knew the whole history. We would not have got the word gospel. This is a political word that has been brought into Christianity and has been brought in to capture the big idea.
Mm-hmm.
So it shows you just how deeply Christianity enculturated itself. And interestingly, it shows how brave they were as translators. They were quite prepared to say, we have no word in our inheritance from Judaism. Well, they weren't even thinking of inheritance. We have no word as Greek-speaking Jews that will capture this whole big idea that God has given us something unique in Jesus. You couldn't use the word covenant. You couldn't use the word Messiah. These are words, the word Christ, a big word meaning Messiah, it just means someone with oil rubbed on them in Greek. So they needed a word that wasn't going to be confused, but was also big enough to capture that they had a new relationship with God because of Jesus. And that's the gospel. And then the gospel is what Paul says he must proclaim. And it's what the Didache says Christians must live up to. They must live the gospel. And that meant people had to find out, well, what does the gospel, what does it mean for us? So there emerges a group of people in the community, and this is already there at the time of Paul. So it's there in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, who are able to give a performance of the gospel. And so there were people who could do teaching. There were people who could tell you what was happening in other churches. They were emissaries, apostles. There appears to have been people who collected money and looked after the poor, and they linked up. Paul talks about those. But there were a special group who could arrive in your community, and they could tell you the big story. The gospel of God, which is Jesus. And because they could tell the gospel, euangelion, they became the evangelists.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the gospel, then we have the traveling performers, the evangelists. And the evangelists, the way they performed the gospel took various shapes. For instance, we know there was one form which was basically a series of sayings, just sayings one after another. We know that because we have the evidence for it hidden under Matthew and Luke. We just call it Q. The gospel was performed as a series of sayings. Then we have another form where you say, well, who is Jesus? Well, you give it as a genealogy. And we know there were several of these because two of them have survived.
When you say performed, do you also mean that it can be dramatized, or is it all?
Well, performed in the sense that they arrived in a church.
Yeah.
And then the community gathered, and they would have given a performance that would have lasted 2 or 3 or maybe even longer hours. And so there were people who could give such performances. We call them rhapsodes. The storyteller is a crucial part of the early Christian endeavor. And Can you imagine going to a one-man show that would last 2 hours? Well, it's at the very limits of our attention span. Our attention span is less than 10 minutes. But there were people in the ancient world who could give a performance of Homer,
Yeah.
which would last several hours. Or they could give one of the great Greek myths, which would last several hours. And so these people could give you a performance. And if you look at something like the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Mark, Mark is a performance that lasts about 2 hours.
But you also have in Mark, you often have the sandwich stories which start and then you wait for what's happening. So you
Oh,
capture them
yes.
at the end.
Well,
But it's
if you
Luke.
think, one of the things that we see happening is that the really good performers are in demand. So they're not only giving a performance now, but they're leaving a text. And the text can be copied and the text can be read. So you could take it to another church, and in another church, you mightn't be able to get one of these great performers, but you could get a reader to turn the performance back into sound.
Yeah.
In the 2nd century, we have a little statement from a bishop who says he really likes to hear the gospel from an evangelist, one of these real performers. In other words, he likes to get a real performance by one of these people. But if they can't get that, he just hears a reader reading one of their texts. So a live performance was what they liked. And second evolution takes place. And this is the question: was this an evolution that was Mark the first, or was Mark just the first that has survived? Someone realized that sayings material is not as attractive as a biography form. And Mark has a very loose biography form. It tells you stories about Jesus, and they could be shortened or lengthened. You can see that Mark can get the first part of Mark can be, perhaps they started late or people were looking tired. He could shorten it. Or perhaps they were very energetic and they were a very good audience. He could lengthen it. But it has roughly, here's what Jesus did, starting up in Galilee and then moving down to Jerusalem, and then the great crucifixion, the last days in Jerusalem, the crucifixion scene, the death scene. And that was it. Mark doesn't have a resurrection story. The resurrection story is added later. So Mark may have been the first to say, well, the way I'll tell what it means to believe in Jesus as the gospel is to tell the gospel as the life and death of Jesus. And then that evolves, and we see other people telling the life and death of Jesus. Matthew is one. Luke is another. A variation on that is John. But again, the 4 different performers whose names we know, because their texts have survived, are very, very different.
And they had different audiences.
Well, they were probably using the same audiences because the very fact that they all survived means they were being copied in the same places. And that's why they're all in the Aegean, because in the Aegean you have a network of islands. It's very easy to get around. It's very easy for a performer, an evangelist, to be here today, tomorrow or the next day somewhere else, next week somewhere else again, because you don't have to walk. So, for instance, we know that this evolution is taking place in Christianity, but of all of the evangelists, only 4 have survived as texts. They're all in Greek. So we don't know what's happening in Syria. We don't know what's happening down in Egypt. They're all in Greek, and they all overlap with one another, which shows they were copied in the same environment, because Mark was copied by Matthew and independently copied by Luke, and Luke was used by John. So we know, and both Matthew and Luke were using another text, which was probably almost certainly in writing, called Q, which is some other evangelist, but never became as famous as those four, because once you actually got a reputation, people said, we had such and such here last week. And then they can say to the next church, would you like a copy of our text? And we know that the early Christian communities not only were evolving easy ways for non-experts to copy their texts. That's why our Gospels are all in the shape they are physically. They're codices, not scrolls. But also we know that there was a special official in the church who looked after the books, the huperetes. And these are, again, if imagine you're on a Greek island and you become a follower of Jesus, but you're also the shipping agent for a big concern that's importing stuff and exporting it. You have all the skills to keep books and to copy books and to send messages around. So we have to think of the community needed a word that captured the idea that God has sent us something in Jesus that's established a new relationship. For this, they take up the political word, gospel.
And ever since Paul, is that right?
Before Paul, it's used before Paul.
Before Paul even.
Paul takes over the word. Paul takes over the word as a word that his communities already understand.
Yeah.
So whoever made this brilliant act of translation, this brilliant act of inculturation, breaking with words like Christ and covenant, all these words would continue as in-house words within the churches. But the churches knew that if they were to talk to Greeks who didn't have a background in Judaism, they needed a word that was automatically graspable. And so they said, God's gospel is Jesus. And then they bore witness to that. Then they performed it. Then there were performers who traveled, evangelists. And then the texts the evangelists left after them became known as the evangels, the gospels. So the gospel, the gospelers, the gospels, reading a gospel.
Thank you so much. I think that next time when we are at Mass and we hear the gospel according to Luke, for example, we know where it comes from, and it's not just the good news, but it has a historic context. Thank you so much, Tom, for helping us to understand the history. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Out there, oh, peace is calling. In the bonds of love we meet. For the world, a new day dawning and shine.